And tonight, I'm really, really looking forward to this. So I don't know if I've ever told you to. Andrew Beckham is here and Laura Wilson, both amazing photographers, very talented and well known and documented and well collected, and it's quite an honor. I love photography, and I think a part of what I love about fine art photography is that I have absolutely no idea how it happens. Like I get the darkroom process and all that kind of stuff. When photographers start throwing around f-stop and lens speed and all, I'm out. I just, it seems to me like there's too much math involved. And you know what? So I am wondering if you both would tell me how photography caught you. Like, why did it become your medium of choice? And I'm going to spotlight you both. And we're going to, and we're just gonna, let's just talk about this because I'm really curious. Laura, what happened?
Well, I can answer that quite quickly, Rose, because I was stopped in my tracks as well by photography seeming to be a scientific form of expression. It was f-stops and shutter speeds, because as a child I looked at U.S. Camera, which was a great collection, yearly, annual, of the best photographs of the year. And of course many live photographers, documentary photographers, Cartier-Bresson, Eugene Smith, all of the great photographers of the 40s and 50s were in the U.S. Camera. And I remember reading, I would read the details of a photograph and it would have the f-stop. So I think, oh my gosh, I'll never be able to do that. And it wasn't until I was actually, because I came to photography through painting and drawing. And it wasn't until I was actually given, when I was, maybe in my 20s or teens, I guess I was in my teens, a good camera. And I thought, oh, well, it's a good camera that does all that f-stops and shutter speeds. And it's not, I'm not under a Deerdorf the way Timothy O'Sullivan was.
Right.
I think that some photographers are very technical. So for instance, I would say Ansel Adams, but I, and the photographers that I most am interested in myself are less technical, I would think. So to me, it's not about f-stops and shutter speeds. It's about the content, the emotional content and the composition, the geometry of the picture.
Wow. Okay. And that's, I guess I hadn't realized you came by way of painting.
Yes, yeah. And so I felt I had a jump start when I became serious about photography, because I knew about composition and form. And I also, this I felt was gave me a good foundation, was that I knew the history of painting and sculpture and even the history of photography, so that I didn't begin shuffling around in the weeds. I felt, a good photograph has to hold up against the very best paintings. And I didn't substitute one for the other. I thought, if I have a good photograph, if I've made a good photograph, it should hold up in the history of photography or in painting. It shouldn't be because it's a photograph, it gets a pass. It's not as good as a portrait in paint.
Wow. Okay. So Andrew, I want to hear how you came by way of it, but you're making me think of another question. Is comparing photography to painting and painting to photography. So, but Andrew, how did you get here?
Well, it was really fascinating to hear Laura's story, because there's some overlap there. But I have kind of a funny little wrinkle in my version of that process, which is that I went to, back in the early 80s, when I was in high school, I was at the High School for the Performing and Visual Arts, which is one of the oldest magnet art programs in the country. And when I took a black and white darkroom photography class for the first time, it scared me. I was overwhelmed. The f-stops and the shutter speeds and the film speeds and the the focal lengths and the depth of field and all of the technical stuff. I just was very intimidated by, and I didn't do very well in the class, which I find kind of amusing now. But it took a few more years, and what happened in that intervening time is I went to art school and really got to work on my BFA as a works on paper printmaker. And that really is where my formal training came back around to intersect with photography again when I was a little bit older, and was able to wrap my head around it in a completely different way. And I think part of that is, when I kind of jumped back into photography in my early 20s, I was seeing all kinds of parallels between certain aspects of a printmaking practice and certain aspects of a darkroom practice, because you're making multiples, you are making adjustments to the image through a series of fairly technical processes. But for me, things like dodging and burning, toning with selenium, popping highlights with potassium ferrocyanide, all of these kinds of darkroom techniques to me had a real parallel to what was going on with aqua tinting and intaglio printmaking that I was doing. So there was a real parallel there that really made sense. And in terms of, the other sort of funny piece is that upon graduating from undergrad and really wanting to be serious about having a creative practice as the central part of my life, as a young artist, I couldn't afford to put together a printmaking studio, but I could afford to put together a darkroom. And so part of it was, it was creative practice built out of necessity and possible for me at the time.
Wow. Oh, that's a wonderful story. So I know you both came through photography before digital cameras, and I would love to know a little bit about that, because I think a lot, correct me if I'm wrong, happens in the darkroom. And I remember in Santa Fe, Andrew Smith Gallery had a show of one Ansel Adams photo that he had reprinted numerous times over the course of the what?
He did that
a lot. Yeah, right. And you know what to me was so fascinating is he had it small sized. He emphasized the foreground. He emphasized the background. He emphasized the moon. He did it giant size. And I thought that was just, to me, it was a fascinating show to see how he was thinking through a process or thinking about what was important and maybe thinking back on a memory and just maybe remaking the memory in a way. I don't know, but I'm wondering if you each would talk about the darkroom process and the transition into digital. And did things switch for you?
Well,
yeah, Laura, go.
I love the darkroom, and I think that came from coming out of painting and drawing. So I was very interested in the darkroom, and I liked working in it for long periods of time. And I was kind of obsessive as a photographer in the darkroom. And then also working for Richard Avedon, not in the darkroom, but working as his assistant, I saw the degree to which he worked with prints, and it was amazing. I mean, a great big print, maybe 5 feet by 8 feet, and the labor that would go into making a print like that. The other thing that I think that people who collect or are beginning to collect photography, people who collect paintings and drawings, don't realize that you can't make one photograph, even though you may do an edition of 10 or 5, you can't make, 1 is not the same as 2, and 2 is not like 3. You can't actually duplicate a photograph one through, say, an edition of 10, which is what I usually do. So the darkroom work, I think, is extremely interesting. And to go to digital, I bring the same degree of sort of casting a cold eye on a print that's been digitally printed for me, as I would something coming out of a conventional darkroom. So I want the same quality from a digital print that I expected, that I worked for in the darkroom.
How about you, Andrew? What's been that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I worked in the darkroom for the first, half of my career, and I think I may have mentioned this when last we spoke, but I miss it, although I still have my foot in the darkroom because I still teach and the darkroom work, and so it's great to be able to share that whole experience with my students. But in terms of my own practice, it had gotten to the point that even doing best practices in terms of ventilation and wearing the respirator and all the rest, that some of the processes that were really critical for me to get my prints to make them look like I want, and I mentioned them earlier. I mean, the two main ones are selenium toning, and then potassium ferrocyanide for really making highlights kind of glow. Even with best practices, I was starting to. There was a physical toll. I was really pretty sensitized to that stuff, even with protection. And so for me, getting to move out of the darkroom, because of the advances in digital technology, both capture and output, has been, in some ways, frankly, it's been kind of life-changing because it's just for my health, it's just been a whole lot better. And a lot of my work, as is pretty evident when you start looking at the kinds of things that I do, they take a physical toll as well, because I am out in the field in a pretty aggressive way to make the images that I make. And so having a kind of a light-filled studio to work in that is chemical free has been helpful.
Yeah. Well, and the same for you, I'm assuming, Laura, the chemicals in the darkroom.
Yes. Yeah. I perhaps am not as I'm perhaps a more straightforward printer than you are, Andrew. I think maybe you are a more at a higher level of making a print. So for me, I mean, I spent a long time in the darkroom and cared very much how a print looked, but I wasn't toning them and I wasn't maneuvering them. I was burning and dodging as opposed to perhaps doing the kinds of things that you're doing, platinum printing or all of the different forms in which you can work. So that would be one difference. And I think the biggest thing for me digitally is the fact that I don't have to carry film because traveling, I might have mentioned this the last time we spoke, Rose, but it was very difficult to fly with large amounts of film and to do assignments and bring film. And then I was getting because depending upon the airport, they would often demand to open the film. And it seemed to me the most dangerous countries were less strict than the most benign locations. So that, for instance, I'm going to speak against Albuquerque, drove me crazy, opening my film.
Oh my God.
Ruining the film. But so for me, to travel digitally is much easier, and it makes travel so much easier.
I would completely agree with that. The last big international travel I did with film was when I was a Fulbright scholar, and I spent a year in Jerusalem as well as in Jordan and in the West Bank. And I was still shooting film at that time. And, what Laura said is so interesting to me. Getting into Jordan from Israel with all that camera gear in that film was a breeze. What was funny was getting back into Israel was a little more complicated. So that's a great point. Traveling digital is a whole lot easier.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Wow. This makes me think of a photographer whose work I saw 30 years ago in Santa Monica, actually, in a gallery there. I fell in love with it, and I didn't have 2 nickels. I was just out of college, and but I wanted to buy it. And he has since passed away. His name is James Fee, and he did so much work in the darkroom. Are you familiar with him, Andrew?
Just a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, really just incredible work, but all that darkroom work. And Robert Benjamin is another photographer here in Colorado who did a lot of color work, and he has really just suffered with a lot of health issues to the point where he can't even walk into a darkroom. Just the chemicals in there, he has a
and color chemistry is a whole other animal from black and white. It's
right.
It's
even worse, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Laura, you had mentioned something about, and we were in the beginning of this conversation about paintings and having that background, understanding painting and design and all that. And Andrew, you clearly have that as well. It's a funny thing because painters, when somebody says, "Oh my gosh, that looks just like a photo," they always kind of cringe. They're like, "Yeah, thanks," because that's not the point of it. Even hyper realists aren't trying to create a photo with their work, and the same with photography. And I feel like, and thankfully not with your work, but I feel like there are photographers who have tried to look more like painting in some way, or try and cross that. And I'm wondering if you would talk about the art form of photography. And I really wanted to talk to you both about the kind of the difference. We're talking about photography, also a nuance of documentary photography and fine art photography. And Andrew, I'm wondering what your thoughts are, because clearly you've both have done a lot of each. Tell me about the difference there.
Well, in a way, the way I would think about, if there's a line between so-called documentary and so-called fine art photography, I think it's a pretty thin line. But I guess the way that I would think about either of those approaches to image making, in terms of, this is something I talk about with students at the beginning of every semester, right? Is how is it that, we all have smartphones now. Photography has become this medium that is incredibly vernacular. And that's been true for a long time, but now more than ever with social media platforms, that there are literally billions of images in the world that people have made. And so how is it that some few of them make their way into museum collections, but most of them do not? And how do we start to even think about what makes a photograph art? And how do we quantify that? And to me, part of the answer to that question, because it's a complicated question, right? But part of the answer to that question is, are there images that become part of a larger cultural conversation, right? And for me, that can happen with a quote unquote fine art photograph in the same way that it can happen with a documentary photograph. And it's when it becomes part of a larger cultural landscape that is valued across a variety of different platforms. It's valued maybe first by a gallery in a collector base, and then maybe it's valued in the context of this is worth publishing by a publishing company that specializes in fine art work, and then maybe museum curators see the work and start to think that there's that this is work that needs to be in a collection so that it can become accessed by the public in a more universal and egalitarian kind of way. And so what happens as a result of all of that, right, is it becomes part of that larger cultural zeitgeist of the time, but then also in art historical terms, it becomes part of a larger art historical conversation. And all of those different rivers flow back into culture. And to me, that's where those connections are. And so when you look at it that way, I don't make too much of a distinction between the label of fine art and documentary.
So Laura, let me toss this back over to you too. And you're more of a portrait artist, or I see a lot more portraiture from your work. And so we were briefly kind of mentioning photographers like Robert Frank, who did The Americans as an outsider, and that work is, if I'm remembering this correctly, was actually kind of maligned when he first came out with it, but now like people really go back and look at that as part of the time, and seeing America through this lens of an outsider, which is kind of fascinating. And so I'm wondering, Laura, same question to you about documentary versus fine art, and how you see it through your work, and especially in particular through portraiture.
Well, I don't think there's any different. I actually don't know what fine art is. I don't quite get it. And so if a photograph is a good photograph, a strong photograph, it has emotional content, and it has composition, and it draws you in. Well, it may have been done to document what happened, say, in Washington on January 6th. That doesn't mean that it's relegated to photojournalism. And because a photograph can emerge and become so strong because of its composition and form and emotional content that it is a piece of art, and of course a portrait can. And I think that photography should be compared with painting and drawing and sculpture, and it needs to hold its own. And it can't be considered, what I sort of started to say earlier, just because it's a photograph, it doesn't get a pass. And that it has to hold up against, so for instance, a portraiture. The very best portrait photographers, and they're few and far between, but they're really, the great ones are great, and just as in painting. So Lucian Freud, for instance, I think is a great painter. Mm-hmm. I think that a photograph, a portrait, should hold up against a Lucian Freud painting, and if it can't, it isn't, is not worth looking at, because anyway, that's.
Well, okay. So, all right. I'm with you 100%, both of you. So what about Photoshopping and all of this kind of stuff? Like, is it,
well, why not Photoshop? I certainly feel that's fine. I guess we're talking about certain things that were sort of set in stone 30, 40, 50 years ago. So, it was, Cartier-Bresson took a photograph and he never touched it. It was, he prided himself that was within the frame was the perfect image. But I don't feel, he was really great, but that doesn't stop, it doesn't stop me from wanting to improve a photograph by manipulating it within the frame. Mm-hmm. So in that way, I'm more aligned, aren't I, with painting and drawing. Mm-hmm. And to go back to documentary photography, I'm very, very interested in documentary photography. I'm very interested in photojournalism. And to emphasize again that the very best of that work it can hold its own against the very, I don't get fine art. I don't understand the term fine art. To go back to that, either it's good or it's not good.
Right, right. Okay,
can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add something, because I loved that idea about what why is manipulation an issue, and Laura, you're absolutely right about the whole sort of Cartier-Bresson idea of street photography and showing the whole frame, and the composition happens there and you're done. But I think it's worth pointing out that in the 19th century, when film wasn't sensitive, didn't have a wide enough range to capture the brightness of the sky and also the shadows of what was ever happening in the foreground. And so, Watkins and O'Sullivan and all those guys who were making images right after the Civil War in the American West they would photograph the landscape, and then they also would photograph lots and lots of skies, because it took two different exposures to do that, because their film wasn't sensitive enough. And so, 100 and, 30, 40 years, 130, 40, 150 years ago, these guys were combining different images to make a composite. So the idea that photography is somehow this pristine thing that never gets touched up is ridiculous. I mean, they were doing photo collage in the 19th century. So,
That's interesting to point out.
Okay.
And I do think that maybe fine art photography is that a kind of, I also feel that people are so new to photography, in the world of big collectors and in museums, that they often confuse, is fine art photography, and is that something that's confused by museum curators who perhaps have come out of an academic background and don't realize what art really is?
That's a really
that I would accept a person saying my work is fine art photography. It may not be documentary photography, but I just don't. The term fine art photography seems very pretentious and sort of without a base.
And that right there, I think, is the heart of the issue and the question that I often have, because, when you're talking to curators on that side of photography, it's like, well, how's this in and that's out, or that's in, or what is it? And I think I wonder if, because photography is really so new compared to everything else, there was definitely painting that was poo-pooed, and now we just can't get enough of it, right?
Well, that's true. I mean, the figure now is coming back in painting, but ever since World War II, we had abstract expressionism, and then, pop art, and then minimalism. So things move in patterns, and that's true in photography as well. So perhaps non-representational photography was more appealing. I don't know actually what the movement is right now. You probably know much better than I do, Andrew, but I do think there are movements in photography and in collecting. I often, this is my own opinion, obviously, but I do feel that museum curators are often the last to really know what's happening and to know what's good. I mean, what person with a great eye is in the curator? I mean, if you have a great eye and the energy, you're going to be an artist, you're going to paint, you're going to be a sculptor, you're going to be a photographer. So I think we have to be leery of what museum curators are saying and collecting. I don't think they're collecting maybe the most interesting work.
Well, and two, they are, I think they're looking at it from that collecting perspective, and probably have a lot of political pressure on them, right?
Right.
That shouldn't be part of the decision necessarily, maybe?
Well, the whole question about, that fine art label, I mean, it is I completely agree, this very nebulous label in terms of trying to actually, get a really articulate definition around that. But what I would say, with regard to very contemporary work, I mean, I think about the show that was at the Denver Art Museum a few years ago that I was a part of.
The landscape.
New territory landscape photography today. And I will say that I think Eric Paddock, who was the curator, did a pretty brilliant job with that exhibition.
And I should say too, Rose and Andrew, that I'm sort of, shooting out a firestorm and there are, of course, there are great curators, but they're few and far between. And those with imagination and vision and real creative eye are few and far between. But that isn't to say they aren't there. Just as it's the same in photography.
And I think what you're getting at, Andrew, too, is that Eric actually is a really very talented photographer as well. So
he also has a creative practice, and that's a great point. But the thing I would point out about, just to give an example, right, about the whole label of fine art is one possible way to think about it. If we were to try to wrap a definition around it, is so. Just as one example, there was a piece in that exhibition, and what the artist had done was to collect images off of the internet, not images that she made, of vernacular photographs that people had made of sunrises and sunsets, and collected, thousands of them, and put them together as a grid. And so the artwork was, a 4x6 foot grid that looked at a distance like a very rich mosaic, mosaic tile work. But what it was made up of was all of these, images that for every single one of those sunrises or sunsets would have held a particular kind of personal significance or importance to the person who took it. But then it gets sort of reimagined and recontextualized in this completely new way. And so I'm not in any way suggesting that that's what fine art means, but I am suggesting that it's one of the things that contemporary fine art can mean, which is a very sort of conceptual approach where the photographic imagery is not even necessarily made by the artist, right? So that's just one example, but I think it's worth sort of contemplating one way to think of what fine art might mean.
Maybe that's a better term, Andrew, conceptual photography, as opposed to fine art, because I do think that that's an interesting term, conceptual photography. It comes from the imagination, the forethought, as opposed to documentary photography.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what we've done, Rose, is we've retitled your Zoom call.
Hey, Laura, we're taking credit for that because we realized that it was a great term Andrew came up with. I like that a lot. Okay, so I'm going to shift the topic just a little bit, and y'all are going to love this one. But when does photography go too far? When is it okay, so was it Thurgood Marshall who said, I don't know what pornography is, but I know it when I see it? when is it, you got a Sally man, or is it invasive, street photographers, things like that. Does photography go too far?
Well, I think it can go too far. I don't know if there are any rules on what is too far, but for instance, Sally Mann's work, I feel, I read her book and seen her work, and it seems to me that she is misstating her original intentions, which were definitely sexual, and sexual implications with very young children, her own young children. And to deny that is something that it's either she was blind or she is not now admitting because it's caused such a furor. So I would feel quite strongly about that work, that body of work, or the images that I'm talking about.
Yeah, Andrew, what do you think?
I can't remember the name of the photographer, Laura, you may know, but he had this was a few years ago, he had a show. Actually, I found his work because the same show came to Denver at our Contemporary Art Museum. But he basically had so this is, I don't know where in Manhattan, but it was somewhere in Manhattan, and there was a brand new multi-million-dollar kind of, building that went up with luxury homes, condos in the building, and they had floor-to-ceiling windows, and he discovered that this thing was being built and moved into right across the street from his dilapidated old studio. And he did a series of photographs using a very long lens, a telephoto lens, of the inhabitants of those new condos just going about their daily lives. Now, what's interesting is that he, in terms of what he published, right, what he put on the wall at the gallery, you never saw anybody's face. All of the figures, all the figurative work was anonymous in the sense that you could not identify who any of these people were, and yet there was never any, there were never any images that were sort of exposing anybody in terms of being unrobed or anything like that. So it was all just sort of daily life in an anonymous way. And the images themselves are very beautiful. The color, the palette, the light, they feel almost like Vermeer's in a sort of 21st century way. But there was a firestorm about that. And the folks who realized that they were the subjects of his photographs that were, for sale for very large amounts of money at whatever New York gallery he was in, they sued him for invasion of privacy, whatever the invasion of privacy laws are. And they lost.
They did lose.
They lost.
The subjects lost?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was.
That's interesting because I thought the invasion of privacy laws were you could photograph anyone in a public space, no matter what they're doing. So in a restaurant or in a park, but once you looked inside a person's house, then that is invasion of privacy.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and you can read all about it. It's easy enough to Google, but I think the reason he won is because they were all anonymous, because you couldn't identify anybody.
Yeah.
The photographer was Arndt
Rear Window, the great Jimmy Stewart, Grace Kelly movie.
Oh, yeah, right. Rear Window, yeah.
But after having told that story, I actually don't know that I have a strong opinion one way or the other. I just think it's a fascinating. It is a fascinating example of where that line is, right?
So I actually think, though, Andrew and Rose, that is an invasion of privacy, because if I were in my own apartment I suppose I see the shades are up and you're walking around, then it's almost like being. That's very interesting. I'd love to know legally how they protected the photographer.
Well, and part of the argument, I think, was that there was a sense in which the people who owned these properties were kind of exhibitionists, because if you really wanted privacy, you'd put up curtains, you'd put up blinds, and it's like, look at my amazing Manhattan loft.
Yeah,
I've got my floor to ceiling windows so you can see. Yeah, it's again very interesting. Yeah, it's
actually a critical subject if you're photographing people, because you think that same person is walking along the sidewalk.
Right.
Okay, you can photograph them, but can I take a picture of the person in his or her apartment? It seems that even though they don't have any...
I know, on its surface, it does not seem okay. I know, it's a really interesting... And hey, Rose, there was a request in the chat for the name of that photographer. Did you pull that up?
Yeah, it's Arne Svensson, Svenson. And it was, it was in... Manhattan, called The Neighbors, a show in New York called The Neighbors. And the judge ruled that though it was, I think he said it was creepy but it's not, it's disturbing. It neither violation of criminal stalking laws nor a violation of family civil rights as state law is now written, because Svensson's photos were works of art.
And again, I think the anonymity of all of the figures, is what allowed that decision to be made that way.
I think so too. Yeah. It says shots of for the tiny nuances of gesture and posture that define who we are collectively. The subjects are to be seen as representations of humankind, not identifiable as the actual people photographed. So yeah. Yeah. But that is, it's interesting because over the weekend, for example, I was shopping at Sprouts and there was a very long line and they needed more cashiers. And somebody up ahead of me turned around with her cell phone and took a shot. I think of the long line, and I just remember thinking I wanted to tap her on the shoulder and say, I don't want you to post that picture that I'm in on your social media. And it wasn't that I was going to be identified or anything like that. It was just in my mind, I thought, if she's going to say something negative about having to wait in line or whatever, like, I don't want to be in that shot, I didn't say anything to her, but it was just, you just assume everybody's going to post on social media and there's no anonymity and you don't have any. So I guess as photographers, how do you deal with that? Like, what do you do about that?
Well, I often photographing people that I don't know, but I never photograph someone that I haven't asked permission to photograph. So if I'm in a public space and I catch and I see someone I'd like to photograph and I'm not able to directly say, may I photograph you, I'm doing this, or, and this is, I would catch their eye and, sort of look in the eye and, make a kind of gesture, is this okay? And if they say no, I never photograph the person who says no.
And
so I don't believe in sneaking pictures.
Yeah. Andrew, what about you?
In my practice doesn't involve portraiture very much. And when it does, it's usually, it's my family. And so there's, right off the bat, there's that. But the work that I've done with my family is rarely published. It's only happened a few times. And I've enjoyed those opportunities when they've arisen. And obviously I have permission from my wife and son to do that. But most of my practice as a photographer has to do with my relationship to place in the natural world. And so it's a very different kind of image making.
Maybe another thing to go back, just as you were speaking, Andrew, about photographing your family, to put something under the guise of fine art photography, as I feel Sally Mann did, that I think is wrong. I do feel that there's a difference in, obviously, in photographing your family. You have permission to photograph your family. You want to photograph your family. You're happy to take their pictures. But if you're doing something with anyone, whether it's family or not, and it's under the guise of fine art, and it makes the person, it disturbs the person, it's not acceptable. Yeah. I don't think.
Yeah. You know what? Let's talk about influences for both of you. And Andrew, I know you have some images to do a little quick screen share with us. And you know what? I'd really love to know about influences, because certainly with like they say, there's nothing new under the sun, right? So I'd love to know how those influences really added to your work. And I'm kind of thinking beyond like any technical thing, but maybe how they brought more of that emotional aspect to it.
Can I do a quick screen share?
Yeah, I think you can. I think you just grab it, right?
Yeah, I'm going to do it right here.
Awesome.
And do that. And then I'm going to go to present here. All right, so this is one of the most celebrated landscape images from the mid-20th century that's ever been made. It's Ansel Adams. we were talking before about what makes a photograph fine art. What does that even mean? And I think that it's reasonable to say that, in 1947, when Ansel made this, the concerns of form, of composition, of the kind of structure of the image aligned him in some ways very much with what was going on in contemporary painting, which is interesting because the contemporary painting was all abstract. I mean, we're getting, at that time we're Jackson Pollock's about to become famous and abstract expressionism is in full swing. So what does that have in common with a super sharp image like this of, moon and half dome? And it has to do with the sort of formal construction of the composition. And so I think part of what happened with Ansel is that he got kind of talked about in critical terms in terms of the form of his work, in some ways maybe discounting the content by the critics of the time. But the reason I have it up here is because, this is what Ansel was doing. I don't know how any landscape photographer doesn't look at his work early in their career, but I want to contrast that with Robert Adams. No relation.
Oh, yeah.
And Robert Adams is still working today, although, he started working in the mid 20th century in the 1960s. But Robert Adams is also a landscape photographer who makes really kind of devastating images about the sort of human impact on the landscape. So this is, the stump of a old growth tree in Oregon in a clear-cut field. And he doesn't shy away from the kind of ugliness and destruction that human enterprise can bring to the landscape. And the reason I have both of these up here to talk about influence is that, for my own work, I realized that I didn't want the kind of formal, the formalism, the mid-century sort of modernist formalism of Ansel Adams, but I also wasn't interested in the kind of very difficult, but I think necessary, but difficult sort of activist work of somebody like Robert Adams talking about the landscape in a really political way. Mm-hmm. So what really made sense to me, to use one more mid-century example, would be somebody like Minor White, who really was interested in using the photographic image as metaphor. So in using the natural world and the landscape as metaphor. So this piece called Easter Sunday, I'll just let the title speak for itself. As you look at this sort of abstracted water image. And so Minor White's approach, I thought, was, when you look at it in art historical terms, was very interesting. Neither a critical assessment of the human mark on the landscape, nor a purely formalist kind of celebration of the natural world, but something else altogether. And that brought me into thinking about the landscape as also being able to, the idea of a cultural landscape. Linda Connor, who, runs the photography program at the San Francisco Art Institute and has been hugely influential on my work over the years, makes, she uses a 8x10 field camera, and in some ways, her, does gold printing out paper. So it's these very like 19th century techniques to make these, and she's traveled the world making these images of these sort of human places, human constructed places that hold real sort of cultural and spiritual significance for the people who inhabit them. And so this was, for me, a way of thinking about landscape, and then, combining that with the kind of metaphor of Minor White that made a whole lot of sense to me. And I'll show you one more slide. Thomas Joshua Cooper is an American photographer who lives and teaches in Scotland. And he also uses a 19th century camera and makes images. This one, you'll notice part of the subtitle is Message for Timothy O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan, of course, was, one of the photographers who photographed the West with the USGS after the Civil War. And O'Sullivan originally made his own image called Mythic Stone. And so, Cooper's referencing him here, and Cooper's work, although in some ways it looks like very traditional black and white landscape, it's actually very conceptual, because Cooper is interested in sort of the kind of larger cultural question, and sort of also the metaphor of what does it mean to be at the edges of significant places all over the globe. He has made photographs from literally the tip of South America, the westernmost point of Iceland, you name it. And so it's like these edges and these points, and thinking about Magellan and circumnavigating the globe and mapping it for the first time, and coming back around to think about the sort of way humans interact with landscape. It's very traditional imagery that is working in very conceptual terms. So I will stop there. That is my little crash course in some photographers that have really informed my work.
I love it. I love it. Hey, so, okay, I have a funny little Ansel Adams, two funny little Ansel Adams anecdotes. I had a friend, I lived across the street from this older couple when I was in college, and they've since passed years back. But Paul Becker worked at where Half Dome, not Yellowstone. Sorry, Yosemite.
Yeah.
When he was out of college, and he said when they were in Yosemite, and in the middle of winter, and they were cutting the ski trails and stuff, and this crazy photographer came into camp, and just hilarious, so entertaining. And he said the funniest thing was this guy named Ansel Adams could play the piano with his butt cheeks.
Apparently, he was a trained classical pianist.
He was a classical pianist, right? It was hilarious. So anyway, my friend had met him. There's also another astrophysicist.
You're skating on thin ice.
I know. Hey, talk about 6 degrees of separation. Anyway, okay. So there's an astrophysicist, Donald Olson. Have you heard of this guy? He has his assignment for his students is to try to pinpoint the exact second when Ansel Adams took his photos of Half Dome. And he figures out exactly when those photos are going to reoccur, and then post them. And actually people flock to Half Dome to take their own Ansel Adams. So he got in quite a bit of trouble by researching what was happening when Munch did The Scream. And the curator, who has studied Munch, was quite upset, because he let everybody know that there had been volcanic action going on, and the skies were quite red at the time. And, and so maybe it wasn't all of this angst going on, but actually the skies were that color red. He got in a lot of trouble for it.
It's funny.
Yeah, but people enjoyed it. Okay, so Laura, influences and how these have worked on you and kind of guided your path into what you've done for the last several decades.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Andrew for that brief little slide show, because that was wonderful. And it was very good for someone like me who does not do landscape photography to see what you are seeing and what influenced you. For instance, it's the first time I think I've looked at that Yellowstone picture and thought, gosh, it's like a Franz Klein. But I didn't quite, Cooper, when you said he's working sort of he's working in a traditional way by showing that waterfall, but he's pushing the outside edge. I didn't quite understand what you meant by that. Could you explain that?
Sure. Just that Cooper's interest has to do with sort of human exploration, particularly in the 19th century, and the way that the world was first mapped by Western powers in longships, right, sailing, circumnavigating the continents. And Cooper's gone back and gone to the sort of historical places where boats first made landfall, to historical sites where, for instance, again, the Cape the tip of South Africa, Patagonia would have been used as a kind of a visual marker for those exploratory ships. And so he's gone and he's photographed at these various sites as a way to try to think about the sort of human enterprise of doing that in the first place, and what that has or hasn't gotten us over the last 200 years. And so I guess my point is simply that the photographs he makes and the way that he makes them are very traditional in terms of their aesthetic and in terms of their process. But in terms of the ideas that he's thinking about and the reasons that he's taking them, they're very contemporary and very...
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting. Thank you.
So Laura, to me, Andrew, thank you, because that really does help me and, see into your work. And I'm looking at this lovely photo over your shoulder here, and I remember you said that you took it on the day you learned that the notorious she had passed away. But you see that with your influences, you see how that is coming through in your work, and sort of this I think more in an esoteric or a spiritual kind of sense with the work and what you're trying to convey with these places that you've stepped in, and bringing the viewer in a different way. And so Laura, with you and your work being so figurative, and, I think there's such a different thing about, because you're working with a model, and you're trying to capture something different, but in a way well, maybe you tell me, you're trying to capture an essence of a person, or how does that work?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. What was your question, Rose?
Is it the difference between how you're working and influences in your work? And you worked with Richard Avedon for many years, assisting him years ago. And so influences, but also working with the figure is such a different thing. So for me, the human form has everything. And I think there is so much in a face, in an expression, in the shape of a body. So it's completely absorbing to me, and has been sort of a lifetime of work. And I have done documentary work in the West, and up in, Hutterites up in Montana, this picture here of the people on the hay bale. But I think what interests me now is portraiture alone. So it's not so much portraiture in the landscape as portraiture on its own, to try and reveal as much as possible about a person and human nature. And maybe it's, and they're all, I think Leonardo da Vinci said all painting is sort of self-expression, a self-portrait. And I do think that's true, because you're trying to understand yourself, really, and you see that in another person, another face. But I think that I'll show you a couple of portraits that might be of interest to you. And Laura, and a question also came in too. Do you see your photographs as telling stories about the subject? So,
I hope it's revealing something about the subject. So, for instance, this is the writer, Zadie Smith, who is Jamaican English, and she's a very much admired writer right now. And so and she's very, very beautiful, but I haven't photographed her as a beautiful woman so much, but to show the strength and the intensity with which she has come, at a very young age, come forward in the literary world. So I think that this is a strong portrait.
And I love that, Laura. I love that, because she is beautiful, but you're capturing her essence as a strong literary force.
Yes, exactly. And then here is Richard Avedon, and I photographed him in Montana. And
Wow.
it's just a picture, it's a snapshot, it's a document.
Yeah.
But it shows his wit and humor and the qualities of a show that made him such a good photographer.
Right. Wow. 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 Oh, fun.
And this I don't think is such a strong portrait, but I just sort of grabbed it as it was right here. It's the architect Ricardo Legarreta, Mexican, who did the most beautiful buildings and always used pink and purple and orange in the buildings. And here he is in his own house. So it's a kind of shows his elegance and refinement. But I don't think it's necessarily a great portrait, but it does reveal something about him. Let's see if I have a good portrait. Well, here's something that I think this is a good portrait. It's, oh gosh, I don't know if you can see it that well.
Yeah, that's good.
But it's a high school homecoming queen with her boyfriend and her little mother following behind in her sneakers with her little corsage on the mother and then her camera in her hand. So it's a document and it shows sort of the fun of high school and I think it holds up over, I mean, I took this maybe 20 years ago, but I think I don't know how well you're seeing it, but
yeah, it's good.
In any case, I think it holds up as a photograph.
Well, and you know what, too, there's something about it. It does have a timeless quality, and then it does strike, you know, the viewer on an emotional level, because we all kind of had an
experience. I mean, sorry, Rose, to go back to it, I mean, the sweetness of the girl, this girl is so pretty and there, and so sweet looking, and the boy with this very attentive expression on his face. It reveals a lot about high school, about small town, about family.
Mm-hmm. You know, you both have issues that you have to work with, don't you, with your subject? You know, like Andrew, you're working through the issue of capturing a moment, you know, through the clouds or with the light, and everything is having to come right for you. And Laura, you know, you're dealing with human emotion, and I'll tell you, my husband cannot take a good photo of me to save his life. And I think it's because of our relationship. I can't just breathe. And I always look at him and I'm like, what happened? You know, and I think so what I want to end on is the emotion the photographer brings to the work and how that affects the work, good or bad.
I think that's critical, Rose. The photographer has to bring emotion to the work, whether it's landscape or portraiture or for lack of a better word, documentary work. Unless there is some, so for instance, I was photographing a great writer, a two-time Booker Prize winner. His name is Peter Carey, and I asked him about another young writer who's coming up and who's getting a lot of attention. And I said, Peter, and he's established, a much older man in his late, well, probably early 70s. So I said, what do you think of so-and-so? And he said, she's a very good writer, but I don't know that she has the heart to really, that her work will last. And I think that's the same thing in photography, that unless there's some heart in a photograph, whether it's a landscape or the kind of work that I do with people and documentarian work, that it has to have that. You have to, the viewer has to connect to it in a way. And you connect, just as you connect with people when you're talking with them. Someone who has heart and emotion is someone you're going to respond to. And it's the same thing, I think, in a work of art.
Wow. Really well said. Andrew, how about you?
So Robert Adams said that we make photographs to make images about things that are more interesting than we are. And I would tend to agree with that. For me, it's about trying to make images that become a metaphor for the whole with a capital W, right? I mean, if you want to talk about it in sort of spiritual or even in the scientific world in cosmological terms, frankly, how do you make an image that is like a hologram? And what I mean by that is, I'm not talking about visually like a laser constructed hologram that moves around when you shift it, but I mean, how do you make an image that is a little tiny piece of the universe that we all live in, and yet the image speaks beyond itself? It's an image that is both incredibly grounded in the specifics of the place where the image was made, but that place, because through the construction of the image, through the composition, through the formal way that the photographer frames the image, through the way it's printed, through the quality of light, that all of those things contribute to the specificity of that place, also talking about the universality of the kind of structure of the universe itself. How does the intimate or the specific reflect, again, the whole with a capital W? And for me, that's where the heart is. That's where the revelation is, because the revelation is recognizing that we are a part of that we are connected to that.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So that's how I think about it. Yeah.
Wow, you two have a lot of soul, I gotta tell you. Hey, so we are actually after the hour, but there's one more question that came in from Michael Smith. It would seem that photographers have an opportunity that other artists do not have, and that is to be able to have a copy of every work they make. How does that archive affect your work, and does that archive become a burden? Huh. Interesting.
Too early to tell.
Too early to tell? Yeah. Andrew, what?
Oh, I see. That's a whole other hour's conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
The heck of the archive.
Yeah.
Let's get out from under it.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say about that, which is not an answer, that is a huge question, but the one little thing I'd say about it that I find interesting is that the archive has become more existentially fragile. And what I mean by that is that, when you're working in film, you actually do have the quote unquote originals. You have the physical negatives. When you're working digitally, it's all ones and zeros on a hard disk or in the cloud. And so there's something very strange about the quote unquote archive and the quote unquote originals really being digital files that exist in a way that's not physically tangible. And if you're
How many backups do you do, Andrew?
3.
Is that what you do, Laura?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's still a little uncomfortable, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And
But I think that the archive, to answer the question more thoughtfully, is that you are aware of what you've done, of course, but you're trying to push forward, and that, of course, is the essential thing, is to keep pushing forward, so that you're open to what you see and what's a possibility, and from conceptually as well as in a documentarian's point of view.
yeah. But what a joy to really have that work to go back through. I had never thought of it that way, but yeah, you do. That is kind of a wonderful thing. All right. Well, okay. If I don't stop now, I'm going to launch into one of the many other questions I have on my notepad and didn't get to. I can't thank you enough. And you know what, Laura, Laura and I have talked on the phone, and she has yet to come out to one of the Coors shows. So I have seen you twice in 2 months, in a month and a half.
That's right. Well, maybe that's for sure to come to the next time that you're in place. I'll come.
Okay. You all heard it. Perfect.
Thank you, Rose, very much for your questions. And thank you, Andrew, for I enjoyed working with you on this. So.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you both. Hey, have a great night. And thank you all for stopping in and being part of this. I appreciate it. And we'll see you tomorrow. We've got talks all week. So thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.